The world is full of dark and unexplored depths of scary and terrifying experiences. How far does the darkness go? Let's find out. This is 4 creepypasta stories to keep you up at night. Story number 1. The Back Rooms. It was approximately 12:15 when I entered the Johnson County Community Health Clinic. I was there for an appointment I had set up weeks ago, just a routine checkup. It wasn't a new place for me. I had been there a couple of times before. However, the place had an odd, nostalgic feel to it, as if it were a location from my childhood or something, and I could never pinpoint exactly what this feeling was or where it came from. As I walked in, an overwhelming feeling of déjà vu swept over me. The hum of the flickering fluorescent lights, the white tile flooring, the muted beige paint that colored the walls. I noticed that there was a TV mounted in the corner, a small flat screen that was playing a short PowerPoint slideshow on a loop of ads and events that were being held by the clinic. I passed the empty waiting area, a small area of the main room with magazines, children's playthings, and blue cushioned chairs, and approached the woman at the front desk. She was sitting in her bluish, gray office chair, looking at a spreadsheet on the same Windows XP desktop they've had since 2008. There was a sign-in sheet on the counter in front of me. "I have an appointment with Dr. Peebins?" I asked. "What time?" 12:30, I replied. She began typing something into her keyboard. "Ah, yes," she responded. "Gary Johnston?" "Mm-hmm." "Yes, I'll tell the doctor. Please fill this out." She handed me a clipboard which held a simple fill-out form. I walked back to the waiting area, took a seat, and began to fill out the form. I was about halfway done with filling in my information when I slumped back in my chair. I hadn't gotten much sleep the night prior, and I was exhausted. As I slumped back, I noticed something very peculiar. My head never hit the wall. In fact, it felt like it went in. I got up, quite frightened, and looked at the wall. Nothing. Not a single hole or dent had been made in the wall by my head. So I reached to touch the wall, and my fingers went through it. I recoiled in shock. What the hell was that? I thought as I reached to touch the wall again, only to find my fingers clipped through once more. Then suddenly, I lost my balance, tripped, and fell directly through the wall. I fell face first onto some dirty tan carpeting. Upon getting back up, I realized that I was in a completely different room. Well, not really a room, per se. More so, a set of rooms, all of which connected by openings. The walls were covered in gross tan, patterned wallpaper. There was also an overwhelming stench of moist carpet. I turned back around and tried to put my hand back through the wall, and it wouldn't go through. Okay. What the heck? I muttered. I looked back into the room. There were no windows, no doors, nothing on the walls, other than that disgusting wallpaper, of course. It was completely empty, aside from a singular plastic blue school chair. At this point, the only thing going through my mind was fear, and the repeating thought of, "I need to leave," on loop in my head. I started running through the rooms, desperately trying to find an exit, but to no avail. There was no exit. Was this my permanent location until I died? No, there had to be a way out. I wasn't just going to be left here, right? Eventually, someone would notice that I was gone. But nobody did. Then, in the distance, I heard footsteps, but not those of a human's. At least, not a normal human. Alongside the footsteps was a gurgling snarl, like that of an angry animal. I began to run. I ran as fast as I could from whatever the hell was approaching me. I didn't want anything to do with it. I ran for what seemed like forever, but I was always back in the same room I started. At least, it looked like the same room. Not that I could tell them apart. So I sat down, defeated. A feeling of dread filled my body. As I started to cry, I was going to die here. I'm still there. I haven't left. I've accepted my fate. In fact, I can actually hear footsteps. I wonder who that is. Story number 2. The Red Rose. As a little girl, I loved visiting my grandmother during vacations. She lived on a massive property in the countryside. I loved it there. The large, sprawling mansion, the orchards, the pond and the woods behind the house provided a welcoming departure from the hustle and bustle of city living. I would wake up to the songs of birds, play with Grandma's dogs, feed the ducks in the pond, eat juicy apples, guavas, and mangoes from the orchard, and enjoy all the simple joys that were a rarity for a city kid. My grandfather had passed away a few years earlier, and while Granny had some loyal and caring servants, Mrs. Avery the housekeeper, Mr. Brown the driver, and Miss Phillip the cook, along with her many friends, she was always glad to have family. Not in the least because she needed caring for. Even in her advanced years, she was remarkably fit and active. She just loved having people over. Ever since I can remember, the woods behind the house were off limits. It was never adequately explained to me why. I just wasn't allowed to go there. So of course, when I reached the age of 13, the I am invincible age, I decided that on my next visit, I was going to explore the woods. The afternoon would be a perfect time for this excursion. Granny had a pretty active social life and would often be gone for hours during the day. Miss Phillip the cook was usually busy in the kitchen, Mrs. Avery would be busy cleaning every nook of the mansion, and Mr. Brown the driver would of course be with Granny. I could tell the staff that I was taking a nap in my room so they wouldn't look for me, and I could easily have an hour to look around the woods. Soon after Granny left for a luncheon, I casually mentioned to Mrs. Avery that I would be napping in my room. Then at an opportune moment, I snuck out through the back door. I pushed my way through a thicket of bushes and weeds and entered the forbidden land. Though it was a hot day, the trees all around me cast cooling shadows. I felt like I was in an Indiana Jones movie, exploring a hitherto untouched land and looking for hidden treasures. My daydreams were cut short when I came upon a large banyan tree. Its ancient appearance, provided by the many prop roots that protruded from its branches and surrounded it, gave it an almost otherworldly bearing. I approached it with trepidation. Not knowing the cause of said trepidation made me even more nervous. It was just an old tree, after all. I touched its trunk, its prop roots, and was surprised to see that there were no squirrels or birds on the tree. This was odd. I decided I had seen enough for one day and decided to head home. As I turned to leave, I stumbled over a thick stone slab, twisting my ankle as I fell. For some time I sat on the grass, massaging my foot. When the pain eased a bit, I looked more closely at the stone slab and was surprised to find that it was a gravestone. It was almost entirely covered by ivy. Obviously, no one had been near it for years. I tugged at the ivy and some of it came away in my hands. There was some indistinct lettering on the grave, half obscured by grass and moss. I could make out a name, Rosabelle, but little more. I sat there for some time, pondering over my discovery and wondering why Rosabelle should have been buried at so lonely a spot when there was a cemetery not far away. Why hadn't she been interred beside her kith and kin? Had she wished so? And if so, why? As I limped towards the house, I realized that I would have to tell Miss Avery what I had done, as she would surely notice my limping and would have questions as to how the injury had occurred. Miss Avery was like a second grandmother to me. I would often confide in her about my minor mischiefs. She would always be the one to tell Granny and would serve to soften the blow of her scoldings. I walked into the study where Mrs. Avery was cleaning the bookshelves, and before I could even say anything, she noticed my limp and asked, "Oh dear, what happened?" I told her what I had been up to. As she bandaged my ankle, she said she would have to tell my grandmother about this. Only when I pleaded with and promised I would never go there again did she agree to keep Mum. But only this once. If I broke my promise, Granny would certainly hear about my misadventure. I decided that since she already knew I had been in the woods, I may as well ask her about the grave. On hearing the name Rosabelle, Mrs. Avery seemed rather disturbed. She claimed to have no knowledge of such a grave or of any woman of that name, but I could tell that wasn't true. I begged and pleaded for her to tell me, and she finally broke, just to get me off her back. Rosabelle was your grandfather's first wife, she said. This was news to me. I had no idea that my grandpa had been married before. I had a multitude of questions. Why was it that I never knew about her? Why was she buried out in the wood instead of in a cemetery? Did Grandma know about her? How did she die? Mrs. Avery answered all of these with her usual calm. I didn't know of her because she was mentally unstable and had killed herself, and no one in our family talked about her. She wasn't buried in the cemetery because in those days suicide was not looked upon with favor. It was considered a sin, and was usually a source of great shame to the deceased's kin. Yes, Grandma knew about her, but didn't like to talk about her. Yet she had hung herself from the old banyan tree. I asked Mrs. Avery what she meant by she was mentally unstable. What mental illness did she have? She said she didn't know exactly, as all this was before she came to work for my grandparents. But if rumors were to be believed, Rosabelle heard voices and saw things. The next day, I decided to make use of a few psychology and psychiatry books in the study and found all of the symptoms pointed towards schizophrenia. I instantly felt compassion for the poor woman. She was probably ridiculed, misunderstood, and never received the medical attention as she needed. Mental illness being as stigmatized as it was in those days, she was probably treated like some kind of abomination. Though I had promised Mrs. Avery that I would never go into the woods again, I decided to visit that grave just once, if only to pay my respects. I snuck out again the next day when everyone was otherwise occupied, and plucked a red rose from the garden. This was arguably an even greater crime than going into the woods. My grandma was very particular about her garden, and picking flowers would earn a reprimand. The old banyan tree still looked foreboding, even more so than before now that I knew the history behind it. It looked as though it had somehow been a party to the dark deed. Poor old tree, forever burdened with the emotional turmoil of human beings. I placed the flower I had stolen on the dirty, neglected grave. I cleared away as many of the weeds as I could with my bare hands. Then I felt a breeze. It was barely noticeable, and I would have dismissed it as a figment of my imagination had I not looked up and seen one of the branches move. What made it strange was that there was no breeze blowing through the rest of the woods. The other trees were perfectly still. I decided I had done enough and left in a hurry. That night, strange dreams disturbed my sleep. I didn't remember much about them when I woke up. All I could recall was the face of a beautiful woman. She sat beneath the banyan tree with a red rose in her hands. She seemed content. The dream only left me perplexed, not frightened. What perplexed me even more was that in the morning when I woke, I found a red rose, moist with dew, lying beside my pillow. Story number 3. Our friend heard something in the woods. My friends Raj, Kavita, Ajay, and I are avid campers. Our love for the great outdoors compels us to take time out of our busy schedules at least once a year. Last year, in the summertime, our camping destination was Mount Abu, a lovely hill station in the Indian state of Rajasthan. This trip seemed rather special as it brought some much-needed respite and distraction from the hardships and turmoil each of us had been facing in our daily lives. Raj's experiences have been particularly difficult. His parents had died in a car crash, his girlfriend had cheated on him, and he had recently filed a harassment complaint against his boss. He had not had a great year, and this had caused him to go into depression. The jovial, fun-loving Raj that we knew seemed to be slipping away. When we first planned the trip, he had refused to go, telling us he just wasn't in the mood. That if he did tag along, he probably wouldn't enjoy himself as much and would put a damper on our enjoyment as well. We told him that was bullshit. We were all friends, and that meant we were going to be there for each other in times of need. That if he felt depressed or anxious, we'd be there to cheer him up. Only after each of us reassured him that his presence would add to our fun and not take away from it did he agree to go. We arrived at our campsite in the afternoon. We had chosen a somewhat secluded spot where there were no other campers. The hill station, with its cool breeze, scenic mountains, the beautiful Naki Lake, the flora and fauna, were a sight for sore eyes. Eyes that had been ravaged by the sights of traffic, polluted air, and a heaving inferno of agitated human bodies in the city. I remember noticing something odd about Raj's behavior almost as soon as we got there. He kept looking around with an expression on his face that seemed to combine nervousness with curiosity. He would stop mid-conversation and look behind him, or towards the lake. We asked him what was wrong, and at first he said it was nothing. But as the sun went down, his anxiousness seemed to soar. When we asked again, he finally pointed to the edge of the tree line and asked, "Do you guys see that?" None of us knew what he was talking about, but he kept insisting that he had seen a large figure near the tree line. We told him there was nothing there and gently teased him, telling him he had had too many beers. It at least made him laugh along with us and seemed to ease his nervousness, but only for a little while. At night, as we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and chatting amongst ourselves, Raj's mind seemed elsewhere. He was once again looking at the woods as if trying to make sense of what he saw. Then suddenly he was on his feet, pointing at the trees and yelling that he saw some sort of humanoid figure. As if on cue, just as he began to yell at us, we heard a rustle coming from the woods. It sounded as though a large animal was running between the trees. Though Mount Abu has a variety of wildlife such as wolves, civets, hyena, wild boar, etc., this rustling seemed to be caused by something much bigger. We tried not to get too freaked out, but the fear was palpable. We decided to call it a night. The next morning, Kavita and I decided to ask the local authorities if any large animals were present in the area. They assured us that there weren't and told us not to worry. However, as we were heading back to our campsite, Kavita mentioned half-jokingly that maybe it was the devil-worshipping cults who are said to inhabit the hills. I laughed it off, but the thought stuck with me. I like to think of myself as a rational person, but I had heard stories about various cults in the area that were into witchcraft and devil worship, that they invoked demonic entities which then fed on human flesh. The recent cases of disappearance of 2 tourists in the area certainly did not aid my peace of mind. However, I didn't share these concerns with anyone as I did not want to disturb my friends. We had fun that day, a day of rock climbing, trekking, and enjoying the serenity of nature was just what we needed. Roz was trying to be jovial for our sake. He tried to mask his anxiety with jokes and funny anecdotes, but I could see that he was troubled. I think the others sensed it too. At dusk, we sat around the campfire and ate our dinner. Raj confided in us that he had been hearing strange noises from the woods and asked if we could hear them too. We all began to wonder, had we convinced ourselves that there was no reason to be afraid and missed something obvious? And Raj hadn't? He was the one who had been listening intently for anything out of the ordinary. And could he have heard something? And the rustling from last night, just after Raj had claimed to see something. Either he really saw something, or it was incredibly coincidental. As these thoughts raced through our minds, Raj once again pointed to the woods, this time almost frantically. "Look there!" he shouted. "I see a silhouette. It's huge. Can't you see?" He was pointing towards the trees again. The woods were so dense, it was hard to see anything at all. But then Ajay spoke up. He said he thought he saw something move, pointing his torch beam in the same direction as Raj. One person could have been deceived by his own eyes, but surely not two people at the same time. Kavita looked at us with a haunted look in her eyes. She repeated what she had said to me earlier, only this time there was no trace of humor in her voice. Could those stories be true? About the cults that invoke demons? Those tourists who disappeared, did they see something like this too? I tried to be strong. I tried to tell everyone that we were just letting the woods get to us, that those so-called cults had never been found and we just needed to get some sleep in the morning we would laugh at these fears. I don't think I believed my own words, even as they came out of my mouth. I was just hoping, against hope, that we were safe and we wouldn't have to cut this trip short. I knew that as our schedules got more and more hectic, we would not be able to take these trips as regularly. Kavita and I crawled into one of the tents and Raj and Ajay into the other. Soon darkness enveloped us, and we fell into an uneasy sleep. Our slumber was interrupted, however, by the most horrifying screams I have ever heard. It took me a minute to realize that it was Raj. The screams did not sound like him at all. Kavita and I rushed outside to find Raj on his knees, covering his ears and screaming as if the world was ending. Ajay kept asking him what was wrong. Raj told us through tears that he heard screaming from the woods. "How the hell do you not hear that? We need to leave. Make it stop. Make it stop." He repeated again and again as he scratched at his ears. The sound seemed to torture him. A sound that none of us heard. Kavita, Ajay, and I exchanged looks as we all came to the same conclusion. All those silhouettes Raj saw in the woods, the noises he heard, they were all in his head. Our friend was having a psychotic breakdown. Story number 4. I found a door on my way to work. Ever since my wife left me, I've been sitting in my room thinking back on life, and I've come to a realization. I am extremely boring. Everything I do is the exact same thing I've been doing since I got out of high school. Every day I would wake up, get ready, walk to my work, grabbing a latte and a muffin from the coffee shop along the way, answer phones, and then head home to do it all again tomorrow. Hell, even my weekends are boring besides the occasional barbecue with the neighbors. The real sad part is that this cycle has been going on for the better part of 20 years. That day was going to be the usual routine, but for one reason or another, I felt trapped, so rather than taking a right on the road leading to my work, I continued forward toward the outskirts of town. I had no intention of missing work, but I figured a longer walk would do me some good, clear my head. After a while, I found myself on an unfamiliar path near a large, untamed field of flowers. Along the path were rows of trees whose canopy shaded me from the morning sunlight. I took a moment to breathe in and enjoy the smell of nature before I started walking again. Truth be told, I was so engrossed in that single moment that I wasn't paying much attention to where I was going, so when I slammed into something and fell to the ground, I couldn't help but instinctively yell out an apology before realizing it wasn't a person that I had bumped into, but a door. A big oak door just standing in the middle of the path. I sat for a moment blinking in confusion before slowly getting to my feet. What was a door doing out here? I took a few tentative steps around it and saw that the door stood on its own. There was nothing behind it, nor to the side of it, and there didn't seem to be anything holding it in place either, save for its frame. I bent over to move some fallen leaves away from the base of the door to see that it sat on top of a dirt as well, not in it. I just bumped into it. How can it still be upright? I lightly pushed on it but didn't feel the door move a single inch in any direction. Perplexed, I gave the door another look over, and it was then that I noticed the handle. The handle itself didn't seem too odd, though it was not a design I had ever seen before. It had the round shape of a doorknob and even a small keyhole. But above and below the keyhole sat two metal plates, which jutted outward a little ways and curved over the rest of the handle, leaving only a small diamond of space where the keyhole sat. To me it looked sort of like an eye gazing at me. While returning the strange doorknob stare, I absently reached forward and went to place my hand on it when my phone went off in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw that it was my boss calling to ask why I was running so late. I answered the phone, told him I was coming, and set off for work, leaving the strange door behind me. Throughout the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about the door. I thought about it while the boss chewed me out for being late. I thought about it while I answered calls. I thought about it even as I made my way home, back along the same path I had taken that morning. Every bit of brain power was spent pondering that strange door, so much so that I didn't even realize I was starving because I skipped both my breakfast and lunch. I stopped my train of thought and looked up to find that I was once again right in front of the door. With the light fading as the sun set, I found that I could see a faint glow coming from the door. It wasn't an abrasive glow, but one that was very welcoming. A light vibration also seemed to permeate from it. Feeling a little nervous, I grabbed onto the handle. The vibrations seemed to fill my body as soon as I touched it, and a scene flashed in my mind of the few happy memories I have of my life, one of which brought me to tears. It was of my mother, before she was diagnosed with cancer. I was sitting in her lap, looking up at her, while the leaves from the tree we were sitting under fell into her beautiful blonde hair. It was so brilliant that I could have sworn I became a child again, but almost as soon as the vision came, it faded back into my mind. I wiped away the tears and let out a quiet laugh. With no bit of hesitations, I opened the door. Before me was a large room which looked like a study of some kind. Shelves of books lined the walls, and a myriad of comfortable-looking chairs sat in no particular order in front of a few coffee tables, which were all lined with food and drinks. Beyond the coffee table stood a fireplace, giving off a soft, ambient light. There didn't appear to be anyone else in the room, nor any other entrance with which they could enter besides the door I was standing in. I stepped into the room, not bothering to ask any questions about how it just materialized out of nowhere. I guess I had become so disinterested in my life that I really didn't care anymore. It felt a little like I was trespassing, but the feeling was soon overpowered by the hunger I had been ignoring. I approached the coffee table and found a single plate waiting there and a note which read, "Eat." I studied the note a bit before taking up the plate and moving to help myself. I hesitated a moment when I noticed something strange. The food all along the coffee table, it was all foods that I enjoyed, food that could never be replicated, like my grandmother's macadamia nut cookies whose recipe had been lost when she passed away, and pulled pork sandwiches from the diner in my hometown that closed down a little while after I left. I ate my fill and savored the taste and memories that they dredged up from my subconscious as I laid back on the sofa. I picked up one of many books that were around the room, H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. I attempted to read for a bit before I began to grow drowsy. Even though the room had such a calming atmosphere, I still had work tomorrow, so with much displeasure, I got to my feet and walked out the door, closing it behind me. I looked around to see that I was once again back on the path with the moon now high above my head. Seeing how late it was, I rushed home to start my schedule again. During the next month, I began to incorporate the room into my everyday life. Some days I would go there for breakfast, some days for dinner. Every now and then I would sleep there for an evening. I thoroughly enjoyed every second I spent there. Near the end of the month, I began to notice that everything outside of the room was becoming more and more pointless. Why should I bother working when the room gives me food and entertainment? Why should I bother going back home to a cold, empty house when the room is a lot more welcoming? It was this train of thought that led me to write letters to all the important people that were still remotely in my life. I told them all that I was going away for a while, taking a trip and not coming back for a long time. After I had mailed those out, I went to my work and quit right on the spot. In a flurry of anger, the boss had asked me what I thought I was doing, so simply, I told him. Something I should have done a long time ago. I guess you're just going to have to do all the work yourself now. The look on his face was well worth doing it in person. After grabbing a few things from home, I once again returned to the door. All my bills were paid. I was ready to live the rest of my life in the room, and I knew whoever made the room wanted me to. For the first time in my life, I actually felt sure about something. I opened the door and set my things inside before taking a deep breath and entering. Between you and me, I ended up losing track of how much time passed. With no responsibilities or schedule, everything seemed to flow together. I would have kept track of time with my phone, but I was saving its battery for an emergency if ever one should arise. I had thought that I could maybe keep track of time by how much I ate, but every time I would go to sleep, the food and drinks would be restocked and the dishes would be cleaned. I would have even kept track by now how often I had to use the bathroom, but I never seemed to have to go while in the room. Not that there was a bathroom in there to use anyway. It was almost like I had been frozen in time. By my best guess, it was about a week into me staying in the room when I noticed that one of the bookshelves was missing, and in its place was another door. It had the same design as the other one, save for a note, which hung at the eye level and read, "Come." Wanting to thank my hosts for the wonderful gift they had given me, I quickly set the note aside and opened the door. I was greeted to an extremely long, dark hallway, save for the light the room was casting down it. I could feel a slight breeze coming from wherever it led, so I grabbed my phone and set off down the hallway. The door closed behind me as I left, leaving me in total darkness, though I wasn't worried because the room had been taking care of me and I knew this place was safe. After a few minutes of walking, I began to notice a nasty smell coming from the breeze. I thought nothing of it and continued on. Soon I would be meeting whoever made this place. After 30 minutes of walking, I began to notice the floor began to angle downward gradually. I thought nothing of it and continued on. Soon I would be meeting whoever knew so much about me. After an hour of walking, the walls and floor began to get slimy and smell awful. I thought nothing of it and continued on, as soon I would be finding out the truth. With that thought, my feet lost traction and I slipped, sliding down the sloped floor. I let out a scream and reached out to try to grab onto something, but I could find no purchase, and before I knew it, I began to fall straight down. It felt like an eternity of falling before I reached the bottom of the pit. I felt the bones in my legs break as I landed in a shallow pool of warm liquid. Whatever it was stung my eyes and burned my skin. After thrashing around in pain, I managed to prop myself up to a sitting position. I quickly reached into my pocket and produced my phone. I turned it on and saw it had no bars, as you would expect. Turning its light around me, I found that the liquid I had landed in was a frothy greenish yellow color. All around me, the walls were all flesh and convulsed periodically. Panicking, I screamed out for help, but didn't hear any reply except for the occasional bubble pop from the strange liquid. For a moment, I was hopeful that someone I knew would come find me. That was until I remembered that I had cut them all out. I thought about cursing the one who made the room, but I know it was by my own hand that I was led here. I am the author of my own demise, deluded by the hope of finding happiness and belonging. Nothing has changed but the scenery around me. I sit in my dark room, surrounded by a pool of my own sins, waiting for the end to take me. Thank you for listening to this episode of 4 Creepypasta stories that will keep you up at night. I hope you guys are enjoying these stories as much as I am. I hope you guys are staying safe. I hope you're making good use of this time that we have in quarantine and being in social distancing and all that stuff. So hope you guys stay safe. Continue to listen and share these videos. Also check out Zendependently Minded Combat Sports podcast. I cover the UFC and boxing there and MMA period. So check that out. Share it with your friends and family and stay tuned. And thank you.